Chapter 15. Portus comes to the house of Cairnes. I observed Phyllis Robertson performing the belt dance on love furs spread between the tables under the eyes of the warriors of Cairnes and the members of his staff. Beside me, Ho Tu, the head keeper, was shovelling porridge into his mouth with a horn spoon. The music was wild, a melody of the delta of the Vosk. The belt dance is a dance developed and made famous by Port Car dancing girls. Cairnes, as usual, was engaged in a game of Caesar with Capris, the chief scribe, and had eyes only for the board. As the weeks had worn on, becoming months, I had grown more and more apprehensive and impatient. More than once I had called on Capris myself, and though it was perhaps not wise, to urge him to speed in his work, or to permit me to transmit portions of the documents he was copying to the Sada. Always he refused. I had been bitter at these delays, complaining and chafing, but there seemed little I could do. He would not inform me of the location of the maps and the papers, and I didn't feel that any direct attempt to steal them and carry them away would be likely to be successful. Further, if simply stolen, the others, through Cairnes, would doubtless be informed at the first opportunity, and alternate plans put into effect. I reminded myself again and again, as the month clock rotated, that Capris was a trusted agent of Priest King's, that Misk himself had spoken in the highest terms of him. I must trust Capris. I would trust him. Yet I couldn't help my anger. Ho Tu pointed with his spoon at Phyllis. "She is not bad," he said. The belt dance is performed with a warrior. She now writhed on the furs at his feet, moving as though being struck with a whip. A white silken cord had been knotted around her waist. In this cord was thrust a narrow rectangle of white silk, perhaps about 2 feet long. Around her throat, close-fitting and snug, there was a white enamelled collar, a lock collar. She no longer wore the band of steel on her left ankle. "Excellent," said Ho Tu, putting aside his spoon. Phyllis Robertson now lay on her back, and then on her side, and then turned and rolled, drawing up her legs, putting her hands before her face as though fending blows off. Her face a mask of pain, of fear. The music became more wild. The dance receives its name from the fact that the girl's head is not supposed to rise above the warrior's belt, but only purists concern themselves with such niceties. Wherever the dance is performed, however, it is imperative that the girl never rise to her feet. The music now became a moan of surrender, and the girl was on her knees, her head down, her hands on the ankle of the warrior, his sandal lost in the unbound darkness of her hair, her lips to his foot. "Sarah is doing a good job with her," said Ho Tu. I agreed. In the next phase of the dance, the girl knows herself the warrior's, and endeavours to please him. But he is difficult to move, and her efforts with the music become even more frenzied and desperate. A girl in a tunic of white silk, gracefully carrying a large pitcher of diluted Kalenar wine, approached our table from the rear, and climbed the stairs, delicately, and, as though timidly, head down. Then she leant forward behind me, bending her knees slightly, her body graceful. Her voice in my ear was a whisper, an invitation. I looked at her. Her eyes met mine, beautiful, deep grey. The lips were slightly parted. "Wine, master?" asked Virginia Kent. "Yes," I said, "I will have wine." Virginia served me, bowed her head, and backed gracefully down the stairs behind me, and then turned and hurried away. "She is white silk, of course," said Ho Tu. "I know," I said. Another girl approached similarly, though she was attired in a tunic of red silk. "Wine, master?" asked Elizabeth Cardwell. "Again!" snapped Ho Tu angrily. Flustered, Elizabeth retreated and again approached. It was only on the third time that she managed to satisfy Ho Tu, when her eyes, her lips, the carriage of her body, the words she whispered, seemed to him adequate. "That is a stupid one," said Ho Tu. Elizabeth, angry, backed down the stairs and hurried away. I glanced at Virginia Kent, who was now moving around the tables, in the incredibly brief silken slave livery, the picture on her left shoulder, held there gracefully with her left hand. Her hair was now about 3 inches longer than it had been when she first came to the house of Kernus. She walked gracefully, insolently, the movement of her firing my blood. Her ankles were slender and beautiful. The left, as was the case with Phyllis, was now no longer encircled with the steel band, the identification band. Around her throat, however, as was the case with Phyllis also, there was now a lock collar, snugly fitting, white enamelled. Both girls, branded and collared, were well marked as slave. The belt dance was now moving to its climax, and I turned to watch Phyllis Robertson. "Capture of Homestone," I heard Kernus say to Capris, who spread his hands helplessly acknowledging defeat. Under the torchlight, Phyllis Robertson was now on her knees, the warrior at her side, holding her behind the small of her back. Her head went farther back, and as her hands moved in the arms of the warrior, as though once to press him away and then again to draw him closer, and her head touched the furs, her body a cruel, helpless bow in his hands. And then, her head down, it seemed she struggled, and her body straightened itself until she lay, save for her head and heels, on his hands, clasped behind her back. Her arms extended over her head to the fur behind her. At this point, with a clash of cymbals, both dancers remained immobile. Then, after this instant of silence, under the torches, the music struck the final note with a mighty and jarring clash of cymbals, and the warrior that had lowered her to the furs, and her lips, arms around his neck, sought his with eagerness. Then both dancers broke apart, and the male stepped back, and Phyllis now stood alone on the furs, sweating, breathing deeply, head down. I noted Sura standing somewhat behind the tables. She would not eat with the staff, of course, for she was slave. I didn't know how long she had been standing there. Kernus had watched the ending of the dance, his game having been finished. He glanced to Ho Tu, who nodded affirmatively to him. "Give her a pastry," said Kernus. One of the men at the tables threw a pastry to Phyllis, which she caught, and she stood there for an instant, the pastry clutched in her hands, her eyes suddenly brimming with tears, and then she turned and fled from the room. Ho Tu turned to Kernus, and then he turned to Sura, who was training them. "She is coming along nicely," he said. Sura tossed her head. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will work on it further," and turned and left. I took a deep drink of the diluted Kalenar wine I had been served. In the past months I had spent my time variously. During the season of the races I had often attended them, and on several occasions had met the small tarn-keeper Mip afterwards, with whom I occasionally sat at table. Several times we had taken racing tarns from the cot. He had even showed me at night in the empty stadium of tarns certain tricks of racing, about which he seemed to know a great deal, doubtless because of his connection with the Greens. I learned some things such as the pacing of the bird, the model trajectories for negotiating the rings, techniques of avoiding birds and blocking others, sometimes forcing them to hit or miss the rings. Racing could be, and often was, as dangerous and cruel as the games in the Stadium of Blades, where men met men and beasts, and often fought to the death. Sometimes in the races, in pressing through the rings, fighting for position, riders using goads on one another, or tried to cut the safety or girth straps of others. More than one man had been stabbed as the birds, jammed at the corner rings, had fought for passage and position. Also I had sometimes called the Carpathian Baths. Even after the races were finished, seeing if Nela was available at that hour. I had come to be fond of the sturdy little swimmer, and I think she of me. Also the girls seemed to know everything that transpired in R. The games in the Stadium of Blades finished their season at the end of Sakkara, a month following the season of races. I attended the games only once, and I found I didn't much care for them. To the credit of the men of R, I point out that the races are much more closely followed. I do not choose to describe the nature of the games, except in certain general detail. There seems to me little of beauty in them, and much of blood. Matches are arranged between single-armed fighters or teams of such. Generally warriors do not participate in these matches, but men of low caste, slaves, condemned criminals and such. Some of them, however, are quite skilful with the weapons of their choice, surely the equal of many warrior. The crowd is fond of seeing various types of weapons used against each other, and styles of fighting. Buckler and sword are perhaps most popular, but there are few weapons on Gore which are not seen over a period of 3 or 4 days of the games. Another popular set of weapons is as in the ancient games of Rome, is net and trident. Usually, though, the most skilled with this set of weapons are from the shore and islands of distant gleaming Thassa, the sea, where they doubtless originally developed among fishermen. Sometimes men fight in locked iron hoods, unable to see their opponents. Sometimes men wrestle to the death, or use spiked gauntlets. Sometimes slave girls are forced to fight slave girls, perhaps with steel claws fastened on their fingers, or several girls, variously armed, will be forced to fight a single man, or a small number of men. The surviving girls, of course, become the property of those that they have fought. Men who lose are, of course, slain. Beasts are also popular in the Stadium of Blades, and fights between various animals, half-starved and goaded into fury by hot irons and whips, are common. Sometimes the beasts fight beasts of the same species, and at other times not. Sometimes the beasts fight men, variously armed, or armed slave girls. Sometimes, for the sport of the crowd, slaves or criminals are fed to the beasts. The training of slaves and criminals for these fights, and the acquisition and training of the beasts, is a large business in R, there being training schools for men, and compounds where the beasts, captured on expeditions in various parts of Gore and shipped to R, may be kept and taught to kill under the unnatural conditions of the stadium spectacle. Upon occasion, and it had happened early in Sakkara this year, the arena is flooded, and a sea fight is staged. The waters for the occasion being filled with a variety of unpleasant sea life, water thalarian, vosk, turtles, and the 9-gilled Gorean shark. The latter brought in tanks on river barges up the Vosk, to be then transported in tanks on wagons across the margin of desolation to R for the event. Both the games and the races are popular in R, but, as I have indicated, the average man of R follows the races much more closely. There are no factions, it might be mentioned, at the games. Further, as might be expected, those who favour the games don't much go to the races, and those who favour the races don't often appear at the games. The adherents of each entertainment, though perhaps equalling one another in their fanaticism, tend not to be the same men. The one time I did attend the games, I suppose I was fortunate in seeing Mamillius fight. He was an extremely large man, and a truly unusual and superb swordsman. Mamillius always fought alone, never in teams, and in more than 115 fights, sometimes fighting 3 or 4 times in one afternoon, he had never lost a contest. It was not known if he had been originally slave or not, but had he been, he surely would have won his freedom 10 times over and more. Again and again, even after he would have won his freedom had he first been slave, he returned to the sand of the arena, steel in hand. I suppose it might be the gold of victory, or the plaudits of the screaming crowd, that brought Mamillius ever striding, helmeted, into the sunlight onto the white sand. And yet Mamillius was an enigma in Ar, and it seemed little was known of him. He was strange to the mind of those who watched the games. For one thing, he never slew an opponent, though the man often could never fight again. The afternoon I had seen him, the crowd cried for the death of his defeated opponent, lying bloodied in the sand, pleading for mercy between his legs, and Mamillius had lifted his sword as though to slay the man, and the crowd screamed, and then Mamillius threw back his head and laughed, and slammed the sword into his sheath, and strode from the arena. The crowd had been stunned, and then furious, but by the time Mamillius had turned at the iron gate to face them, they were on their feet crying his name, cheering him wildly. For he had spurned them. The will of the vast multitude in that huge stadium had been nothing to him. And the crowd, their will rejected, roared his praises, adoring him. And he turned. And he turned and strode into the darkness of the pits beneath the stadium. Even the face of Mamillius was unknown, for never, even when the crowd cried out loudest, would he remove the great helmet with its curved steel crest that concealed his features. Mamillius, at least, until he himself should lie red in the white sand, held the adherents of the games in Ar, and perhaps in the city itself, held them in the gauntleted palm of his right hand, his sword hand. Claudia Tentia Hinrabia, the daughter of the present administrator of Ar, though she had now been gone months from that house, had been kept for better than 2 months in the cell for special captures at Kerner's house. In this time her head had been shaved at various times. She was commonly permitted to wear lavish and luxurious robes of concealment, save for hood and veil. The bracelets and chain on her wrists during this time, save in dressing and in the bath, were never removed. And during such times, before the bracelet and chain were removed, a steel slave anklet would be placed on her left ankle, in order that there be no time that her body would be completely free of slave steel. This anklet she wore even in her bath. It would be removed only after the bracelets and chain had been replaced. Each evening 5 lovely, long-haired, uncollared serving slaves would come to her cell to bathe her and perfume and to prepare her for love. These girls, under the instruction of Kernes, were extremely deferential, save that they were continually to amuse themselves at the prisoner's expense, making sport of her shaven head, laughing and joking about it among themselves. 4 times Claudia Tintihinrabia had attempted to kill one of the girls, but the others would easily overpower her, and the Hinrabian must endure her bath and her perfuming. When finished, the girls would lock her raiment in a chest, and then draw a slave hood over her head, locking it in place, and the Hinrabian, stripped, perfumed, hooded, and chained, must wait for he for whom she had been prepared. After 2 months of such treatment, Cairnes, perhaps because he wearied of her body, or perhaps he felt she was now ready, now at the height of her hatreds and miseries, he ordered her sent to Tor, where, I heard, she was collared, marked, and publicly sold during the 9th passage hand, that preceding the winter solstice. It was thought she would probably return to Ar within 2 months. There had been nothing clandestine about her sale, and it was likely that she would be able to convince her master eventually that she was of high family in Ar, and might be richly ransomed. If he were not convinced of her story, or of the agents of Cairnes, would then make a good offer for the girl, pretending to be convinced of her identity, and hastily return her to Ar. It would be better, of course, if her master, bound to be ignorant of the intrigue, would undertake this business himself. The time during this period seemed to me to pass with incredible slowness. Ar lies on Gore's northern hemisphere, is rather low in her temperate latitudes. The long cold rains of the winter, the darkness of the days, the occasional snows turning to black slush in her streets depressed me. Each day I became more and more angry at the time that was passing. I spoke to Capris again, but he, now irritated, reiterated his position, and would speak with me no more. Sometimes, to while away the time, I would watch the girls in training. Sura's training room lay directly off her private compartment, which might have been that of a free woman, save that the heavy door locked only on the outside at the 18th bar, when it became her cell. The training room was floored with wood, laid diagonally across beams for additional strength. One 12-foot area of the room was a shallow pit of sand. Against one wall were various chests of raiment, cosmetics, and retention devices, for girls must be trained to wear chains gracefully. Certain dances are performed in them, and so on. To one side there was a set of mats for musicians, who almost invariably were present at the sessions, for even the exercises of the girls, which were carefully selected and frequently performed, are done to music. Against one wall were several bars, also used in exercise, not unlike a training room in ballet, except that there were 4 parallel bars fastened to the wall, which are used in various exercises. Near the chests of raiment and such were several folded mats and sets of love furs. One entire side of the room, the left, facing the front, was a mirror. This mirror, as might be expected, was a one-way mirror. Various members of the house might observe the training without being noted from behind this glass. I used it sometimes myself, but at other times, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, I would enter the room and sit near the back. Sura encouraged males to observe, wanting the girls to sense their presence and interest. And though I don't think I would have told Elizabeth, her performances with men clearly present, and she knowing it, were almost invariably superior to those in which she did not know herself observed. And there were several men, including myself, who visited the training area with some frequency. In the past 2 months in particular, I noted 2 young warriors, guards, recent additions to the staff of the house. Their names were Relius and Ho Saul. They seemed likeable, capable young men, something above the average cut of the men in the employ of Cairnes the slaver. I suppose they had succumbed to gold, for slavers pay high for their hired swords. The staff, incidentally, had been increased in the last month, largely due to the increasing numbers of slaves being processed by the house, but also perhaps in preparation for the approaching spring, which is the busiest season on the Street of Brands. For then, after the winter, slave raids are more frequent, and buyers wish to celebrate the new year, beginning with the vernal equinox, by adding a girl or two to their household. On the other hand, the single greatest period for the sale of slaves is the 5 days of the 5th passage hand, coming late in summer, called jointly the Love Feast. I recalled a girl once known named Sana, who had been sold in Ar during these days, and who had become the consort of Khazrak, once administrator of Ar. I knew that Kurnus intended to market Elizabeth and the 2 other girls on that feast. It is thought to be good luck to buy a girl on that feast, so prices tend to be high. Long before that time, however, I hoped, with Elizabeth and Capris, to be free of the house. The training of a slave girl, like the training of an animal, tends to be a grueling task, calling for patience, time, and good judgment, and sternness. These numerous latter qualities Sura possessed in plenty. Many were the evenings, particularly at the beginning, when Elizabeth would return to my quarters, and Virginia and Phyllis to their cells, in tears, stinging from the slave goad, confused, convinced they could never please their harsh mistress. And then they would make some small progress, and be rewarded with a kind word, which they found they could not help themselves from receiving with joy. The techniques employed were relatively transparent, much as the kennel technique had been with Virginia and Phyllis, and the girls objectively, rationally recognized what was being done to them. But yet, to their frustration and anger, they could not help, at the moment, responding as they did. "I fear the goad," Elizabeth had told me one night. "I am afraid of it. I know it is foolish, but I am afraid. I will do anything that woman tells me, if only she will not touch me with that goad. I hate her. I know what they are doing, but I cannot help myself. I want desperately to please her." "It is not irrational to fear the goad," I said. I had once been struck with a tarn goad, and I knew substantially what pain must be. Further, the shower of yellow sparks, though perhaps in itself innocuous, was, conjoined with the sudden pain, terrifying. "I am being trained like an animal," said Elizabeth, putting her head to my shoulder. I held her head on my shoulder. And what she said was to a large extent true, for she was being conditioned to certain responses by pain and rewards. Indeed, sometimes the girls would be forced to compete among themselves, with small candies as prizes, and each would find herself, to her subsequent horror, striving eagerly to outdo the others, that it might be she whom Sura would throw the sugared pellet to. Sometimes Sura would let the men, observing, determine which girl should receive the pellet, that they might learn how to win men's pleasure. The conditioning, of course, was subtle as well as gross, being a combination not simply of torment and reward, including the intended inculcation of an image and understanding of themselves as well. In its most primitive expression, this was begun in the first 2 weeks of the girl's training. And the first week, surprisingly, consisted of nothing but the girl kneeling before the great mirror in the position of a pleasure slave for several arn a day. During this time they wore only their collars, and in the case of Virginia and Phyllis, the slave ankles on their left ankles. The point of this, as Elizabeth and I supposed, was simply to accustom them to seeing themselves as slave girls. In the second week they knelt in the same fashion, but had been forced to repeat out loud incessantly the ritual phrase, "I am a slave girl, I am a slave girl, I am a slave girl." Virginia and Phyllis must needs do this in English, Elizabeth in Gorean. In the third week the education became somewhat more subtle, and Flaminius the physician visited the girls for their training hours, and discussed with ingenious subtlety, first in English and then in Gorean, certain views of history, of natural right, of orders of human beings, and of relations among the sexes. The substance of these disquisitions, predictably, was that what had happened to them was appropriate given certain laws of interspecific competition, of conflict and dominance, of the rightful order of nature. They were the women of inferior men who had been unable to protect them. Such men would be conquered when one wished. Their women belonged to those who could take them, who would be the victorious. Hence they were of slave stock by nature. That this sort of thing had occurred always and would always occur, that it was right and just, that as natural slaves they must now bend all their efforts and intelligence to the pleasures of their masters. There was a strong dose of masculine superiority thrown in, and the common Gorean contention and arguments relating to it, that women are by nature slaves, deserve to be such, and are fully content and pleased only when this is so. Flaminius for a time accepted and encouraged counter-arguments, patiently, as though waiting for the girls with their simple minds permitted it to understand the truth of what he said. Phyllis, I learned from Elizabeth, was particularly wrathful when permitted to be so with Flaminius. Phyllis, it seemed to Elizabeth's amusement, had actually on earth been a rather serious, ardent feminist. She had, as a matter of fact, hated and resented men. Virginia, on the other hand, had been a shy girl, fearing men. Needless to say, both presented Sura with different problems, which in a Gorean girl seldom occur. Elizabeth would sometimes in these weeks come back to the compartment and relate with amusement the subtle exchanges between Phyllis and Flaminius the doctor. In her opinion, and perhaps rightly, the positions of both were subtle combinations of truths and half-truths. Phyllis seemed to regard men and women as unimportant differentiations of a sexless neuter stock, whereas Flaminius argued for a position in which women were hardly to be recognized as belonging to the human species. I expect both, and I am certain that Flaminius recognized the errors and exaggerations of their own position, but neither was concerned with the truth. Both were concerned only with victory and pleasing themselves. At any rate, to my satisfaction, but Elizabeth's irritation, Flaminius commonly had the better of these exchanges, producing incredibly subtle, complex arguments, quoting supposedly objectively conducted studies by the cast of physicians. He quoted statistics, the results of tests and what not. Phyllis, unconvinced, was often reduced to tears and stuttering incoherence. Flaminius, of course, was practised and skilful in what he was doing, and Phyllis was not difficult to catch and tangle in his well-woven nets of logic and supposed fact. During this time Virginia would usually remain silent, but she would occasionally volunteer a fact, a precedent or event which would support Flaminius' position, much to the anger of Phyllis. Elizabeth chose wisely not to debate with Flaminius. She had her own ideas, her own insights. She had learned on Gore that women are marvellous, but they are not men, nor should they be, that they are themselves, that they are independent, magnificent creatures, that it takes two sexes for the human race to be whole, and that each is splendid. Following some 2 weeks of these discussions, which seemed to me at the time at any rate to be a waste of training time, Virginia Kent, who had feared men, had come to weigh seriously, if not to accept, certain of the theories of Flaminius. Phyllis to fight them and reject them as hateful slanders, and Elizabeth to regard them as an entertaining and stimulating hodgepodge of sophistry, reality, nonsense, and propaganda. All three girls in the last week were taught certain standard answers to certain standard questions put to them by Flaminius, whether they agreed with them or not. These questions, to which simple, standard, memorized answers were to be promptly volunteered, were put to them over and over until they, even Phyllis, responded without thinking. Certain of these questions and answers, suggesting their nature, would be: question, what are you? Answer, I'm a slave girl. Question, what is a slave girl? Answer, a girl who is owned. Why do you wear a brand? To show that I am owned. Why do you wear a collar? That men may know who own me. What does a slave girl want more than anything? To please men. What are you? I am a slave girl. What do you want more than anything? To please men. There is, beyond these, an entire set of questions and answers, some of them considerably more detailed, and involving standard responses to simple questions pertaining to such matters as history and psychology. The truly sinister aspect of even this portion of the girls' training did not become evident to me or to Elizabeth until the entire next week was spent again before the mirror, seeing themselves as slave girls, and repeating aloud these questions and answers, as though putting them to themselves. As though, with Flaminius gone, it was they themselves, the girls, who were putting these questions to themselves, and responding with almost hypnotic automatism. It was perhaps easiest on Elizabeth, who knew she was playing a part, that she would be sooner or later carried to safety. But even Elizabeth more than once awakened with a cry in the night, clutching me and whimpering, "No, no, no." The 6th week of the training was spent, as several of the former, before the mirror, but this time repeating over and over aloud, "I love being a slave girl. I love being a slave girl." At last, after this cruel and almost interminable repetition, utilizing simple psychological principles, intended to brand into the girl's psyche the identity of a pleasure slave, the girls began the period of exercises, many of which would, for certain periods of the day, be carried through the next months. During the next weeks and months the lessons of Flaminius were never again touched upon, except occasionally for her amusement by Sura, who would suddenly cry to one of the girls, at the same time brandishing the slave goad, such an query as, "What do you want more than anything?" To which the girl, to her shame and astonishment, would find herself crying out in fear, "To please men." And then Sura would say, "Then learn what I am teaching you." And they would respond, fearing the goad, "Yes, mistress." In the hours that Virginia and Phyllis were not in training, and the training hours are only 5 an a day, they were locked in their cells, particularly in the beginning. Elizabeth, on the other hand, usually assisted Caprice in his office. Later, when the girls became reasonably proficient in Korean, they were permitted the freedom of the house baths, which they enjoyed, and the liberty to move about the house rather as they pleased, saving that they must be locked in their cells by the 18th bar. The foods given them also changed with the advance in their training, and the desire to have very tasty fare, and sometimes a small bowl of Kalina with their supper, drove them to perform well. Further, each must eat the same, so pressure was brought on each to come to a given level, for the food of all remained the same until each had attained the desired next level of training. By the end of the 12th week of their training they were eating well, and by the end of the 15th very well, usually 2 low-calorie foods, nourishing, a good amount of protein, diets supervised as carefully as those of racing tarns or hunting sleen. Elizabeth was the only girl who had, so to speak, a compartment of her own, with a door that might be shut rather than simple bars, and so the three girls often, when possible, would come to the compartment for some moments of privacy. At these times they would, as well as possible, converse in Korean. Elizabeth taught them much. She didn't permit them to know that she spoke English. I would often leave the compartment at these times, but sometimes I would remain. Elizabeth led them, to some extent, not to fear me, leading them to believe that she had done so well serving me that she had, to some degree, engaged my affections. I think she did not realize how true her words were. In the beginning, when moving around the house, the girls had been permitted only the garb customarily worn in the sweat and motion of the training, a rectangle of silk about a foot long, thrust into a silken string knotted around the waist. Virginia and Phyllis would not even leave their cells so clad until Elizabeth called upon them, so clad herself, ordering them forth. Phyllis had been tearfully furious that she should be so seen, Virginia terrified. But on the orders of Elizabeth, who spoke with authority, they followed her forth, frightened, but heads high and shoulders back, and soon they were delighting in the sights of the house, for they had seen little but the kennels, the training rooms, and their cells. It had been a good day for them. Each was female, and Elizabeth had taught them that this was a permissible thing to be. "These men are slavers," Elizabeth confided to them. "They have seen women before." Later, in the 18th week of their training, they were given brief silken slave livery, sleeveless, fastened by the loop on the left shoulder. Virginia and Phyllis were given white livery, Elizabeth red. It was at this time also that Virginia and Phyllis had been given their lock collars, white enamelled, and that slave ankles, the identification bands, had been removed from their left ankles. Elizabeth, at the beginning of her training, had simply exchanged her yellow collar for a red one. She had already been a lock collar girl. By the 20th week of their training, the girls could converse rather adequately in Korean, and Virginia and Phyllis continued to improve. Elizabeth, of course, was totally fluent in the language. Elizabeth's accent was interesting, for it was, in effect, Tuchuk. The accent of the girls was that of R. I noted, however, that Sura had insisted that the girls not refine their accents overly much, for it must remain clear that they were barbarians. Further, Virginia and Phyllis were encouraged to slur and lisp certain sounds, it being thought appealing in a female slave. On the other hand, Sura, who did not slur and lisp these sounds herself, did not insist on it, for some reason, with the girls. Accordingly, Elizabeth, Phyllis, and Virginia, not being forced to do so, did not adopt this affectation. I learned independently from Ho too that this particular form of speech defect was, however, no longer in style. Perhaps if it had been, Sura would have been more adamant. Once Virginia had, in our compartment with Elizabeth and Phyllis, shyly looked up at me, and asked if I knew the name of the blonde guard, he with blue eyes, who came upon occasion to observe the training. "Relius," I said. "Oh," she said, dropping her head. "And the fellow with him often," I volunteered, "is Ho Sol." "The ugly one?" asked Phyllis. "The one with the black hair and the scar on the side of his face?" "Well, I don't think he's ugly," I said, "but I think you mean the same one as I. He does have black hair, and there is a scar on the side of his face." "I know him," said Phyllis. "He keeps looking at me. I detest him." "I thought you," said Elizabeth, "you were dancing to him this morning." "I was not," snapped Phyllis. "And yesterday," laughed Elizabeth, rocking back, clapping her hands. "Yesterday, when Sura asked him to stand forth, that one of us might approach him to administer the first kiss of the captive slave girl, it was you who first sprang to your feet." "I have scarcely ever seen anyone move so fast," commented Virginia. "It's not true," cried Phyllis. "Not true? Perhaps he will buy you," suggested Elizabeth. "No!" cried Phyllis. "Do you think we'll be sold at the Carillion?" asked Virginia of me. "It is apparently the plan of Cairns," I said. "I wonder," said Virginia, "if someone like Relius will buy me." "Perhaps," said Elizabeth. "I doubt it," said Phyllis. "You are too skinny, and your face has pox." "I am not ugly," said Virginia, "and I cannot help it that I do not have a body like yours." Phyllis tossed her head, sniffing. "I was afraid of men," said Virginia, her head down. "But now I find I am curious about them. I didn't know what to do or how to act with men. But now I am a slave, and I am being taught. I am being shown what to do. I'm not so afraid of men now." And she looked at Phyllis. "I want a man," she said. "Slave!" jeered Phyllis. "Don't you want a man?" asked Virginia, tears in her eyes. "I will have nothing to do with men," said Phyllis. "Oh, yes, you will, pleasure slave," Elizabeth assured her. "Oh, yes, you will." And Phyllis cast her a withering glance. "I wonder what it would be like to be in the arms of a man," said Virginia. "Like Relius?" asked Elizabeth. "Yes," said Virginia. Phyllis laughed. Virginia dropped her head. "I am ugly," she said. "I am unworthy of being sold at the Carillion." "You're a slave," laughed Phyllis. "Only a slave. Virginia, the little slave." "I am a slave," said Virginia, and she added, "and so are you." "I'm not a slave," cried Phyllis. "Pretty little slave," laughed Virginia, pointing her finger at her. "Never say that to me!" screamed Phyllis, leaping to her feet. "Pretty little slave!" screamed Virginia, and Phyllis leapt upon her. In an instant the two girls were rolling and scratching on the stones, screaming at one another. "Stop them!" cried Elizabeth. "Stop them!" I spoke calmly. "Free men do not much interfere in the squabbles of slaves." The two girls stopped fighting. Phyllis stood up, breathing heavily. Virginia rose to her feet and stepped back. She brushed back her hair with her right hand, and both girls looked at me. "Thank you," said Virginia. "It is time you returned to yourselves, slaves," I said. Virginia smiled. Phyllis, not speaking, turned and went to the door, but there she turned once more, looking at me, waiting for Virginia. Virginia regarded me. "You are a man," she said. "Does master find the slave Virginia ugly?" "No," I said. "The slave Virginia is not ugly. The slave Virginia is beautiful." There were tears in her eyes. "Could such a man as Relius, do you think," she asked, "desire such a slave as Virginia?" "Oh, doubtless," I said, though irritated with her question. "Were the slave Virginia not white silk, the man Relius would have asked for her long ago." And she looked at me gratefully. It is incidentally one of the perquisites of employment in the house of a slaver that a member of the guard or staff may ask for, and generally receive, the use of whatever red silk girl he pleases. Elizabeth had not been bothered in this particular, because she was, by general recognition, solely mine while I remained in the house. "And," I said rather loudly, looking at Phyllis, "were the slave Phyllis not white silk, she would have found herself used frequently and well by the man who so." Phyllis looked at me in fury and turned and left the room. She walked beautifully sinuous in her rage. "The slave Phyllis," I said rather loudly again, "has learned much from Mistress Sura." Phyllis cried out and turned in the hall, her fists clenched, and then she spun about with a cry of rage and ran weeping down the corridor. Elizabeth clapped her hands and laughed. I glared at Virginia, who still stood in the room. "Go to your cell, slave," I said. Virginia dropped her head, smiling. "Yes, master." And then she turned and left. She too walked beautifully. "It's hard to believe," said Elizabeth, "that she once taught classics and ancient history in a college." "Yes," I said, "it is." "On earth," said Elizabeth, "I don't think a woman would dare walk so beautifully." "No," I said, "I don't think so either." The training of the slave girls progressed. It had begun following the period entirely consumed with exercises, with such small things as instructions on how to stand, to walk, to kneel, to recline, to eat, to drink. Grace and beauty, according to Sura, and I would scarcely dare dispute such an authority, is a matter of expression, both that of the face and the body. I could, week to week, see the changes in the girls, even Elizabeth. Some of these things were taught seemed to me very silly, but at the same time I found it difficult to object. One thing of that sort I recall is a trick when the girls feed the master a grape held between her teeth. She may or may not have her wrists braceleted behind her back for this particular feat. One leg is folded beneath her, and the other is extended behind her, toes pointed, and then she lifts the grape delicately to your mouth. Elizabeth and I used to laugh heartily over this one, but I think it was effective, as I seldom got beyond the third grape. "Observe," once had said Elizabeth to me, to my amusement, in the secrecy of our compartment. "Observe the 12th way to enter a room." I had observed. It was not bad, but I think I preferred the 10th, that with the girl's back against the side of the door, the palms of her hands on the jamb, her head up, her lips slightly parted, eyes to the right, smouldering at just the right temperature. "How many ways are there?" I asked, sitting cross-legged in the centre of the compartment on the stone couch, "to enter a room?" "It depends on the city," said Elizabeth. "In R we are the best. We have the most ways to enter a room. 104. I whistled. "What about just walking straight through?" And she looked at me. "Ah," she said, 105. A good deal of the training of the slave girl, surprisingly to my naive mind, was in relatively domestic matters. For example, the pleasure slave, if she is trained by a good house, must also be the master of those duties commonly assigned to tower slaves. Accordingly, they must know how to cut and sew cloth, to wash garments and clean various types of materials and surfaces, and to cook an extensive variety of foods, from the rough fare of warriors to concoctions which are exotic almost to the point of being inedible. Elizabeth would regard bringing her efforts back to the compartment, and the nights were not infrequent when I longed for the simple fare at the table of Kurnus, or perhaps a bowl of Ho-Tu's gruel. One dish, I recall, was composed of the tongues of eels, and was sprinkled with favoured aphrodisiacs, the latter, however, being wasted on me, as I spent, to Elizabeth's consternation, the night lying on my side in great pain. Elizabeth was, however, to my satisfaction, taught a large number of things which, to my mind, were more appropriate to the training of slave girls, including a large number of dances, dozens of songs, and an unbelievable variety of kisses and caresses. The sheer mechanics of her repertoire, theoretically outfitting her to give exquisite pleasure to anyone from a nubar to a peasant, are much too complex and lengthy to recount here. I don't think, however, that I have forgotten any of it. One thing I thought was nice was that Elizabeth had asked Sura about the dance she had begun to perform but could not finish when we had first come to the house of Kurnus, the dance which is accompanied by the Tuchuk slave song. Sura, who seemed to know everything, taught the rest of it, song and all, to her, and to the other girls. For good measure, she also taught them the independent dance, sometimes called the Dance of the Tuchuk slave girl, which I had once seen performed at a banquet in Turia. "Know that you are beautiful," Sura had once said to them. "Now I will teach you to dance." My own duties during these months in the house of Kurnus remained light, consisting of little more than accompanying Kurnus on infrequent occasions on which he left the house, a member of his guard. In the city, Kurnus travelled in a sedan chair, borne on the shoulders of 8 men. The chair was enclosed, and under the blue and yellow silk which covered it there was metal plating. That night Phyllis Robertson, under the torches in the hall of Kurnus, performed the belt dance while we supped. It was the last day of the 11th passage hand, about a month before the Korean New Year, which occurs on the vernal equinox, the first day of the month of Enkara. The training of the girls over the months had been substantially completed, and would be, for all practical purposes, finished by the end of the 12th passage hand. Most houses would doubtless have put them up for sale in Ankara, but Kurnus, as I have heard, was saving them for the love feast, which occupies the 5 days of the 5th passage hand, falling late in the summer. There was a variety of reasons why he was postponing the sale. The most obvious was that good prices are commanded at the love feast. But perhaps more importantly, he had been spreading rumours throughout the city of the desirability of trained barbarians, of which he now had several in training, those who had been brought to Gore with Virginia and Phyllis, some who had been brought to the pens earlier and not sold off immediately, and a large number who had been brought in subsequent trips to the Voltai by the ship of the slavers. I had sometimes, but not always, accompanied Kurnus on these missions. To the best of my knowledge, one or other of the black ships had come 7 times to the point of rendezvous since I had seen the first one. The house of Kurnus now altogether had better than 150 barbarians in training, under the tutelage of various passion slaves. I gathered that the reports of Sura and Ho-Tu on the progress of the first group, and that of Elizabeth, Virginia, and Phyllis, had been extremely encouraging. In postponing the sales until the love feast, of course, there would be time to complete, at least substantially, the training of a large number of barbarian girls. Also, as Kurnus and doubtless intended, the delay would give his delicately seeded rumours pertaining to the desirability of barbarians time to circulate, time to stimulate the imagination and inflame the curiosity of potential buyers. I gather his planning must have been successful, for sales generally in R during the first 2 months of the new year were down somewhat from the seasonal norms, as though R's gold for slaves was being held somewhat in anticipation of the love feast. I recall one incident worthy of note from that night. Phyllis performed the belt dance. It was rather late in the evening, but Kurnus had remained at the long table, playing game after game with Capris the scribe. At one point he had lifted his head, listening. Outside in the air overhead we heard a storm of feet outside in the street, the clanking of weapons. Kurnus listened, and once again turned to his game. A few minutes later we heard a great deal of shouting and running about. Again Kurnus listened and smiled, and then returned to the study of the board. I myself was curious to know what was occurring, but I didn't leave the table. I had made it a practice normally to eat beside Ho-Tu, to come to the table with him and leave with him, and Ho-Tu was not yet ready to leave. He had finished his gruel, but he was sitting there listening to a slave girl, sitting on furs between the tables, playing a kalika. Several of the guards and staff had left the tables, retiring. Even the girls at the wall had been unchained and returned, after the evening sport, to their cells. Phyllis and Virginia and Elizabeth had long since left the hall. Ho too was fond of the music of the kalaika, a six-stringed plucked instrument with a hemispheric sound-box and long neck. Surah, I knew, played the instrument. Elizabeth and Virginia and Phyllis had been shown its rudiments, as well as something about the lyre, but they had not been expected to become proficient, nor were they given time to become so. If their master, at a later date after their sale, wished his girls to possess these particular attributes, which are seldom involved in the training of slave girls, he himself could pay for their instruction. The time of the girls, I noted, was rather fully occupied without spending hours a day on music. The slave girl sitting on the furs, for the kalaika is played either sitting or standing, bent over her instrument, her hair falling over the neck of it, lost in her music. A gentle, slow melody, rather sad. I had heard it sung 2 years ago by the bargemen on the Cartius, a tributary of the Vosk, far to the south and west of Ar. Ho too's eyes were closed. The horn spoon lay to the side of the empty gruel bowl. The girl had begun to hum the melody now, and Ho too, almost inaudibly, but I could hear him, hummed it as well. The door to the hall suddenly burst open, and 2 guards, followed by 2 others, burst in. The first 2 guards were holding between them a heavy man with a paunch that swung beneath his robes, wild-eyed, his hands extended to Cairns. Though he wore the robe of the metal workers, and though now without a hood, he was not of that caste. "Porters," whispered Ho too. I too had recognized him, of course. "Caste sanctuary!" cried Porters, shaking himself free of the guards and stumbling forward and falling on his knees before the wooden dais on which sat the table of Cairns. Cairns did not look up from his game. "Caste sanctuary!" screamed Porters. The slavers, incidentally, are of the merchant caste, though in virtue of their merchandise and practices their robes are different. Yet if one of them were to seek caste sanctuary, he would surely seek it from slavers and not from common merchants. Many slavers think of themselves as an independent caste. Korean law, however, does not so regard them. The average Korean thinks of them simply as slavers, but if questioned would unhesitatingly rank them with the merchants. Many castes, incidentally, have branches and divisions. Lawyers and scholars, for example, and record-keepers, teachers, clerks, historians and accountants are all scribes. "Caste sanctuary!" again pleaded Porters, on his knees before the table of Cairns. The girl with the kalaika had lightly fled from between the tables. "Do not disturb the game," said Capris to Porters. It seemed incredible to me that Porters had come to the house of Cairns, for so much bad blood existed between the houses. Surely to come to this place, the house of his enemy, he must have been a last recourse in some fearful set of events to throw himself on the mercies of Cairns, claiming caste sanctuary. "They have taken my properties," cried Porters. "You have nothing to fear. I have no men, I have no gold, I have only the garb on my back. Townsmen, soldiers, the very men of the streets, with torches and ropes. I barely escaped with my life. My house is confiscated by the state. I am nothing, I am nothing." Cairns meditated his move, his chin on his 2 fists, one above the other. "Caste sanctuary," whined Porters. "Caste sanctuary, I beg of you, I beg of you." The hand of Cairns lifted, as though to move his ubar, and then drew back. Capris had leant forward with anticipation. "Only you in Ar can protect me," cried Porters. "I give you the trade of Ar. I want only my life. Caste sanctuary." Cairns smiled at Capris, and then unexpectedly, as though he had been teasing him, he placed his first townsman at Ubara's scribe too. Capris studied the board for a moment, and then, with an exasperated laugh, tipped his own ubar, conceding the board and the game. Cairnes now, while Capris replaced the pieces of the game, looked at Portus. "I was your enemy," said Portus, "but now I am nothing. Only a caste brother. Nothing. I beg of you, caste sanctuary." Capris, looking up from his work, regarded Portus. "And what was your crime?" he asked. Portus wrung his hands, and his head rolled wildly. "I do not know," he cried. "I do not know." And then, piteously, Portus lifted his hands to Cairnes, master of the house of Cairnes. "Caste sanctuary," he pleaded. "Put him in chains," said Cairnes, "and take him to the cylinder of Minas Tentius in Rabius." Portus cried out for mercy as he was dragged away by 2 guards, 2 others following. Cairnes stood up behind the table, ready now to retire. He looked at me and smiled. "By the end of Anvar," he said, "Killer, I will be Ubar of Ar." And he then left the table. Hutu and I looked at one another, each as puzzled as the other.